Let's talk about U-came for making stained glass pieces, more specifically suncatcher style stained glass. U-came can also be referred to as hobby came. There are two different ways to finish your piece. One is a beaded edge, and as I'm learning to make stained glass, I've not had much success with it, and the other way is framing it in U-came. I love the look of U-came, and honestly I find it a lot easier to work with than that beaded edge, but I've never had to frame something too intricate. They both have their own benefits, but I find that U-came offers a little bit more stability in your piece overall. Let's get into it. I will say that I think a big reason that I'm not the biggest fan of the beaded edge is because of the soldering iron that I'm working with. I spent a lot of money on an iron only to discover that it wasn't really the correct one for making stained glass, and I'm just being stubborn about it by not getting the correct one until I feel like I've gotten my money's worth out of the one I bought. And I know, I'm probably just delaying my stained glass progress by not breaking down and getting the correct iron, but I do actually plan on upgrading it within the next few weeks. What I say next is probably going to be so obvious for anyone who works with stained glass, but I'm teaching myself at home and there are so many details to take into consideration, so I'm sharing what I've learned in my journey because I know that others will run into the same situations. There are two different types of came. One is called H-came and one is called U-came. H-came is what you would use in between your pieces if you were doing like that lead version of stained glass, which is generally when you're making windows or larger pieces. You would use H-came in the middle and either outline your piece in a zinc frame, custom frame, or even a thicker U-came. So be sure that when you are looking to outline your piece that you're ordering U-came that is intended for the border of your frame and not H-came because it will look a little wonky. You may have noticed that I mentioned the thickness of the came. Both U-came and H-came are available in different sizes. To frame your work in U-came, I personally found that the 5/64 inch is best for suncatcher style pieces. You may want a different thickness depending on your piece, what it looks like, and if you just generally want that thicker border, but that would be a personal preference, or if you're working with a heavier piece that might need that extra reinforcement. I've personally been teaching myself how to make stained glass with the copper foil method. I originally took a lead came stained glass class that allowed me to experience the process and just fall in love with it, but when I decided to invest in the hobby, I decided I wanted to learn that copper foil method. So when I talk about U-came for the rest of this video, I'll be referring to it as in the copper foil method. I personally haven't used the thicker U-came, I've only used that 5/64 inch, but I was told if you do opt for that thicker style, you don't have to do the next step because it will get covered. If you are using the 5/64 inch style, you do need to take the copper foil off of your edges. This is extremely important to know before you actually begin your soldering because it is a royal pain in the butt to fix and remove. If you do plan on using that 5/64 inch U-came, I recommend scraping off the copper foil from your edge piece before you actually start soldering. Once you remove it, which is actually fairly easy when you learn the angle to hold your razor and you're using smooth glass, remember to do your best not to go to the edge with your soldering. You can fix or finish it after you attach your U-came around the edges and it will make it a lot easier than having to deal with your solder causing issues as you're trying to attach that U-came. And what I mean by that is when you are ready to put your hobby came around the edges, it needs to be as flat as possible against your glass. If you solder to the edge, you're going to have some issues with that, and you will either have to remove the solder or really flatten it out. It's just a lot easier to avoid it rather than having to go and try and fix it. There is also an option where you just don't foil the very edge of your piece. I personally don't do that because I don't know, my brain just doesn't work in the way that most people's brains work, and I would rather not have to deal with doing something backwards. I also do think that I struggle with it because I don't usually have my pattern with me when I'm foiling my pieces. If I had my pattern and my pieces laid out in front of me, I would probably be a lot easier to figure out which side wouldn't need that foil, but for now I just foil everything rather than kind of give myself a headache for messing something up because I don't know if you know this or not, but every single step is an opportunity to just mess something up when it comes to making stained glass. If I can avoid a disaster because my brain works a little bit wonky sometimes, I'll just take that extra step, but you are absolutely more than able to just not foil your outside edges. I also feel like it's important to note that you don't want to remove it at the hinge point. You want to remove your copper foil on that very edge and leave it kind of where it meets at that hinge point. This video was my very first time using U-came and I didn't know anything going into it. So everything was foiled, I just did my best not to reach that edge, and there were little pieces that got tinned and they were such a pain to remove. But it really just depends on how attached it is to the rest of your piece. So your piece is soldered and you've removed the copper foil from the very edges of your piece. What I'm going to tell you next is going to make a world of difference. Measure twice, even 3 times. Get as close to that edge as you possibly can when you are wrapping your U-came around the piece before cutting. and then go around it again and get even closer. If you don't hit the edge of your glass, you will have gaps, visible gaps. And I know because I messed up on my second piece in doing this, and I really regret not paying more attention to that detail. That means the tedious task of removing solder if you need to, and instead making more of a tinned edge to those lines that are too close to the edge at the hinge points. When you've measured twice, 3, or even 4 times, and you make sure that your U-came wraps tightly around your edges and you're ready to attach it, it's actually really easy. You have 2 options. You could cut your U-came after you've measured it and are confident with your decision, or you could trim it, solder most of it, and then make the final cut when you're ready to solder where those 2 ends meet. If you have any sort of an overlap of the U-came, you want to make sure that you cut that before you solder. You will see it and it doesn't get hidden like the imperfections when you're soldering the actual glass. Let's assume that you've measured and cut your U-came. You can pin your piece back down with the U-came in between your piece and the nails or pins that you usually use and begin soldering the hinge points to your U-came. Add flux and solder as usual, or you can freehand it. I found that it really does depend on the shape that you're working with. If you have a square, pinning it down is easy because it's usually going to just be flat against the glass. But if you have an odd shape, it turned out better if I just held it with a heat-resistant glove and sort of pressed down as I was working through each hinge point. That also allowed me to triple check that my U-came was actually getting in those nooks and crannies. I also found that if it was an odd shape, I would just trim the U-came so it was more manageable to work with and wait until that last hinge point before I made my final cut in case I could tighten it even more as I was going around. The square piece that you see in the video was easy to measure, so I didn't really have an issue or really think anything of it, but the odd shape one I did after this, I cut without measuring twice and it did not go as well. Does it matter where your U-came meets on the piece? I guess it's kind of a personal preference and the style that you're creating. The square piece that I did didn't matter much, but the next piece that I worked on, I would have switched where I actually had the U-came meet. With the thinner U-came, you really don't notice where it meets anyway, unless you mess up like I did, in which case I would definitely have preferred to hide it somewhere else. But if your U-came is flat, it really shouldn't matter. That being said, going forward, I will definitely be more conscious of where my U-came meets and try to put it off to the side or hidden inside of a bend. More of a precaution than anything else because, as I mentioned, every step offers that single moment to just completely destroy the look of your piece. And no, I'm not being a total negative Nancy and using the opposite of every opportunity as a chance to make it better. I just learned that one single thing that you do could destroy your entire piece, and every detail matters and needs to be paid attention to. I mean, could you imagine you create this beautiful piece and then that tiny detail of a gap in your U-came frame was the only thing you could notice? It actually happened to me, and I think that's why I'm so focused on it, but the person I gave it to didn't even seem to really notice, or at least he was kind enough not to say anything and point it out. Either way, I find that using U-came is far easier than that beaded edge. Not only is it easier where you don't have to worry about gravity, solder dripping down and just ruining your other lines, or the frustration of when your beaded edge just doesn't look as good as you thought it was going to. You also don't have to worry about anything being even, where with the beaded edge you would kind of have to be a little bit more cautious of if there was one side that was a little bit thicker than the other, or what if it's not coming around the edges so the front just looks like a tinned look on the outside. And the best part about it is that it does offer more reinforcement to hold your piece together. And in case anybody is wondering, there are no issues when using U-came and adding hooks. I have still been practicing my beaded edge because I would like to improve my skills in every step of making stained glass, but I definitely prefer using the U-came around the edges.